Okay, our speaker tonight is Ken Roy. Ken is a professional engineer at Oak Ridge, and he's been active. He's still going out to work every day, even though he's gainfully retired, I suspect. And he does a lot of good things. Some of the things he does are totally apart from his professional engineering work. His talk is Terraforming and Venus.
David, thanks a lot. And today I'm going to be talking about terraforming, and if we have time, terraforming Venus, and we'll see how far we get. Okay, next slide. Terraforming literally means earth shaping, and it's basically the process of turning an inhabitable world into a habitable world, something that human life and humans can live on. And there's some various definitions there. Next slide. Okay, that's kind of the history of it. The original concept appeared in 1930. Jack Williamson came up with the actual term terraforming in 1942. A guy by the name of Carl Sagan actually came up with the first terraforming paper, and then the first workshop was held when, 76. So it's a fairly recent discipline, and looking at things that we can do probably far out in the future. But just because it's far out doesn't mean it's not unimportant. Next slide. Okay, this is a pretty view, and if we succeed in our terraforming concepts, this could be an image taken on either Mars or Venus, once it's been terraformed. So that's, the picture gives you an idea of what the goal is, to create Earth-like environments on alien worlds. Next. Next slide. Next. And why do we need to go to alien worlds, live on alien worlds, get into space? I guess everyone's heard of black swan events. Yes, no, okay.
Yes.
The dinosaurs, lived very happily for 150 million years, and one day something happened that they had no reason to expect, and that's called a black swan event, and it pretty well wiped them out. And the same thing could happen to us. So getting humanity out among the stars, living on different worlds is, perhaps a good idea, a good concept for our long-term survival. Next slide. When I start talking about terraforming, one of the questions that I always seem to get is, why do we want to terraform? We can just build space settlements. And, that's a fairly simple question, but the answer is a little bit more complex. First of all, it's not an either or. We could actually, plan on doing both. But, they say we can build space settlements. Terraforming, therefore, is unnecessary, difficult, expensive, dangerous, takes way too long. You run into legal questions. Here's a question to ponder. Who actually owns Mars? Who has the right to terraform it? Who actually owns planets in different star systems? Do we have a right to terraform it? So you run into legal and ethical issues pretty quickly. Okay, next slide. And this is an early image of what an O'Neill cylinder would look like from the inside. So space settlements can be pretty comfortable places to live. Next slide. Here's an image of how you might create a space settlement. Just suck the resources and materials off an asteroid, run it through a fabricator, and you can build almost an unlimited number of space settlements. And this is from an outfit called Space Habs, and if you poke it around on the internet someday, that's a good source to check out. Next slide. And here's a way to push around asteroids to locations where you would want to fabricate space settlements. Next slide. Living in a space settlement can actually be a pretty handy, pretty nice place to live. And again, the Space Hab people have come up with pretty interesting views of what the interior would look like, and it's not a cheap place. Next slide. Waterfalls, golf courses. It can be very pleasant. Next slide. Yeah, not bad. Okay, next. Get a better view of the golf course. Next slide. One of the concerns I have about space settlements is space radiation. And, just to take a couple of minutes to go through it, the solar wind, generates protons, electrons, alpha particles, gamma, some gamma. And NASA's looked at that pretty closely, and they've concluded that if you, provide shielding, 550 grams per square centimeter, you can, cut down the radiation exposure for the people living on the space settlement to, about half a rim a year. And, by way of background, we get about, 0.4 rim a year just here on Earth. So, that's pretty normal. The other source of radiation is cosmic radiation. And, those are particles for the most part. Protons, a few heavy ions. And we can screen from most of those if we up the shielding to maybe 1,000 grams per square centimeter. And water's a good shield. But the problem is with cosmic radiation, there's at the tail end of the spectrum really heavy, really fast particles. We've measured cosmic radiation, here on the surface of the Earth. They detected one iron atom that had made it all the way to the surface of the Earth, and they detected it in a cloud chamber and calculated the energy involved, and it was equivalent to a baseball going 60 miles an hour. So there's a lot of energy in a little bitty particle. And our conventional understanding of radiation doesn't really account for relativistic heavy ions. There have been studies looking at mice and what this kind of radiation does to them. And yeah, you have one particle, but if it runs through the brain, it can leave tens of thousands of nerve cells dead behind it. And at least with mice and probably with humans, you're going to end up with significant cognitive failures. So shielding from this kind of radiation is something new to us. It's probably going to involve heavy shielding and distance, or some combination of the two. We're protected on Earth for the most part because of our atmosphere, which again provides a lot of distance and a lot of mass. And gamma ray burst, we expect these accounted for several extinction events here on Earth. Very high energy gamma, very intense, and depending on how close you are to the source, you're going to need a lot of shielding. If you're on a planet, at least you have half the planet, or at least half the population has half the planet between them and the source, and they might survive. Here on Earth, the ozone layer may not, but that's a thought. So space settlements, I think, have some issues. Well, and space travel have some issues with radiation exposure, as I'm not sure that we've really fully dealt with. Okay, next. Okay, the other objection is we don't need to terraform. We'll just find a living world and move right on in. We know planets are pretty common. We're detecting a lot of hot Jupiters, but that's because those are easy to detect. There's probably a lot of Earth-sized worlds out there too. Some people think Earth is or life is pretty common, and that could be. That's an open question. And also, the definitive study on star travel, Star Trek, they couldn't go more than a parsec without stumbling over an M-class planet. So they must be very common out there. And they always spoke English too. I never understood that. Next. John Preston gave me this, and so I thought I'd work it in. It illustrates that approach. We don't need to terraform, we'll just find what we want. Okay, next. Okay, need to make a little digression to, at least make an argument that, finding a planet that we can move into isn't really tenable. or may not be tenable. There's a lot of unknowns that we're running into. DNA, Earth DNA, based on 4 nucleotides. And I'm not going to pretend to pronounce them TC, AG, you know, and they form pairs, and that allows the DNA to replicate, you know, a pretty elegant system. Okay, next. Okay, forming Earth proteins. Again, if you're a biologist, my apologies, but I'll just go through it very quickly. Messenger RNA is created by molecular machines that run up and down the DNA and create messenger RNA, essentially, you know, punch tape that floats around the cell until it's picked up by another molecular machine that uses the instructions on that punch tape to create proteins. And yeah, there are about 20 amino acids that can be specified you know, on this punch tape, and there's a number of stop commands. It's pretty interesting, you know, way outside my field, but pretty interesting. Of those 20 amino acids, 9 are, you've heard of essential amino acids. Well, those are acids that you can't make in your body. You have to ingest them. If you don't ingest them, you starve to death, even though you have all the food you want. If you don't have the proper amino acids, you know, a long, slow death. Okay, next. Again, proteins are what we make out of amino acids. They're the molecular machinery within a cell, the structure within the cell. You know, they're just critical to life. And Earth proteins are based out of 23. I'm not quite sure how the other 3 amino acids get in there. I think that's the mitochondrial DNA. Linda, that right? No? No? Or you don't know? Okay. So 23 amino acids are what we're all built of. But there's 500 of those things out there. So, you know, one could argue that it's just luck that, you know, when life evolved on Earth, that we picked those particular nucleotides and those particular amino acids. Okay, next. Alien proteins, on the other hand, aren't necessarily restricted to those amino acids, and they could have a DNA system, you know, very different from what we have, or may not even have DNA. But if they're built on amino acids different from what we have, there's going to be an incompatibility. You know, we may not be able to eat them. They may not be able to eat us, although they might try. And what's interesting, in doing some research for this, there was an organization, or a research group in California that came up with 2 new letters and stuck it into a DNA for a bacteria. So that DNA had 6 letters, and it's last I heard it was stable over 20 generations. So there doesn't seem to be anything magical about the 4 nucleotides that make up our DNA. There could be others. Okay, if we landed on a planet that evolved, you know, completely apart from Earth, we're probably going to be immune, you know, to its viruses and parasites. Toxins and allergens, you know, that could be a different story. You know, if it turns up we land on an M-class planet and the life is, you know, based on Earth life, Earth DNA and our amino acids, then I think there are questions that we need to ask. But anyway, if we land on an alien world, the life may not have, you know, the essential amino acids that we need. And also, you know, this toxin and allergen problem works both ways. You know, it'd be a shame to, you know, land on the world and open the door and walk into paradise and then have everything you breathe on die. And one question I don't know, what happens if you ingest lots of alien amino acids? Is that going to result in bad things? You know, that's an unknown. Okay, so the top world is Earth. The world on the right is a living world, what we've been talking about. It's, you know, say it evolved separately around an alien star. And the one on the left is a barren, dry world. I guess I would argue that the one on the left is the one that we should aim to colonize. And the only way we can colonize it is to terraform. The one on the right, I think you run into safety and ethical issues that you know, certainly need to be thought about. Next. Okay, terraforming in, what do we have? 7 easy steps. I guess the first step, you want to know what you're dealing with, so you survey the planet very thoroughly, make sure that there's no life on it that may get you into trouble. That's been the plot of several Star Trek and other alien or other sci-fi movies that I've seen. You're terraforming the world and all of a sudden you find out, oh, there's life. Well, you want to know if there's life on the world before you start terraforming it. And the second step, oddly enough, is to hit it with a big rock if you want to adjust its orbit or a spin rate. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then hit it with smaller rocks to kind of sculpt the surface to something that we may find more desirable. And 4, 5, and 6, can be done in parallel. Adjust the temperature and pressure of the atmosphere, adjust the composition of the atmosphere, and import water for the oceans. And then the final step, of course, is to import Earth life. And again, one of the big advantages of terraforming is you have the life that you want. You import Earth life, so it's going to be, it's going to be agreeable to us. And well, here's an interesting ethical question. Could you leave out certain life forms like mosquitoes and fleas and ticks and poison ivy? I guess that's a choice to ponder. Okay, next. Okay, this is the water phase diagram and shows where Earth is. And up on the right you have Venus, you have Mars, Titan, and it shows you where, how Earth is and how the different temperatures and pressures vary. Next step, or next slide. So to terraform Mars, you have to increase pressure and increase temperature. To terraform Venus, you have to decrease temperature and decrease pressure to bring it within, Earth normal conditions. Next. And this is what the atmosphere we're accustomed to breathing is. Humans don't really need nitrogen, but plants seem to need nitrogen. So we really can't leave that out. Oxygen is pretty important to us. Argon, as near as I can tell, is pretty inert, pretty pointless, so you could probably substitute nitrogen for that. And a little bit of CO2. That little bit of CO2 is very important. Without CO2, all your plants die. And once all your plants die, the animals die. And once those are gone, we go. So, CO2 may be a problem in big quantities, but if you don't have any, you have other problems to worry about. Okay, next. It was the first plant to figure out that you could take water and CO2 and photons and create carbohydrates and O2. O2 is a waste product that it just releases to the atmosphere. Plants, they're not very efficient. They're efficient enough, 3 to 6%. They absorb a lot of energy, 130 terawatts currently here on Earth. So don't discount the plants. And they absorb a lot of carbon, 100 billion tons. I think that's per year. And, the creation of the cyanobacteria resulted in the great oxygen catastrophe 200 million years later. It destroyed most of the anaerobic life. The O2 reacted with the methane in the atmosphere of the time. Losing methane's a grand greenhouse gas. If you lose that, the Earth cools. And that happened, and we ended up with Huronian glaciation, sometimes known as snowball Earth. And that lasted for a good 300 million years until the volcanoes were able to pump out enough CO2 to warm up the planet to get us going again. So again, CO2 seems to be fairly important. And cyanobacteria is that green stuff there on the right. Photosynthesis, comes in really 2 flavors, very similar. And they need light in the blue and red range to function. Notice they're not very efficient with green, and that's why plants are green, because that's the one flavor of light that they just don't really like, so it's reflected away. Next. Okay, complex slide that explains global warming. Yeah, let's skip that. And food, web, soil, dirt. If you go outside and pick up a handful of dirt, you're holding hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of little critters in your hand, all of whom are part of a fairly complex ecology. And if you're going to terraform a world, think of the challenge. You are going to start with sterile regolith, a sterile soil, and you're going to have to introduce earth life, those 100,000 million little critters in dirt have got to be, you've got to, create living soil from dead soil. And again, that's not a trivial problem, but it's probably solvable. And again, I won't go into the complexity of the ecology of dirt, but hey, it matters. Okay, next. Just one of the cycles to keep in mind, one of many, and just illustrates how all this stuff works. We start with plant waste and animal waste, which is, contains proteins. Bacteria eats the protein and creates ammonia. If you smell ammonia, that means proteins are being broken down. And other bacteria converts it into nitrites and nitrates, and then the nitrates are picked up by the plant, and so the cycle continues. But if you're going to terraform, you've got to start the cycle somewhere. And how do you get it going? That's a challenging question, and again, not to trivialize the problem, but it's there. We have a question.
Yeah, Roy. I don't know anything about this, but I've been told that nitrogen-fixing bacteria rely heavily on lightning.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, yeah, the nitrogen gets into the cycle by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they're nitrogen-fixing plants. But most of the nitrogen in the cycle is in the cycle. Now some, of course, gets lost, and it has to be replenished by, people who or things that put nitrogen back in the cycle. Okay, next. Plate tectonics, kind of interesting. The Earth has them. Mars doesn't, and Venus doesn't. And the current thinking is that that explains why Earth has a magnetic field, and Venus and Mars have very marginal, if any, magnetic fields. Plate tectonics means that the planet has an efficient way to get rid of heat that allows movement of the core, planetary core, which creates magnetic field. But if there's no plate tectonics, there's really no easy way for the planet to get rid of heat, so the core stops moving and the magnetic field dies out. So if you're going to terraform, you've got to be aware of what's going on inside the planet. Does it have a magnetic field? And again, getting back to CO2, again, there are lots of cycles involved here. Carbonates, formed on land and get washed out to sea. They lay on the sea bottom and eventually get subducted back into the core, where they're heated up and pressurized. Breaking down, the CO2 is released and escapes through volcanoes. So again, remember the great oxygen catastrophe of some time ago. It was this cycle that got us out of it, and that's where the CO2 came from. Plate tectonics. Okay, next. Okay, a big open question, and if anyone has any light on the issue, I'd certainly be glad to talk to them. We've all evolved in one gravity, here on Earth. We have a fair amount of experience of zero gravity, microgravity because of the International Space Station. But the effects on humans are pretty tough. One researcher, I was looking at said, hey, all these effects of weightlessness on the human body, in effect, mimic accelerated aging. Bones get weak, muscles get weak, hearing goes, eyes go. So yeah, we're not good at zero gravity. But we don't really have any experience with low gravity environments, like you would find on Mars or the Moon. So the question is, how low can you lower gravity before humans are not able to function effectively, or not able to reproduce, begin to run into health problems? And I don't know the answer. I'm not sure that we will know the answer until we actually get out there and start experimenting. So that's an open question. Next. Okay, that's terraforming in a couple of nutshells, some of the issues that we have got to contend with. So if we have time, let's terraform Venus. And again, I think Venus is interesting because it's effectively Earth's little sister. Mass, escape velocity, gravity, pretty similar to Earth. Has no magnetic field like we talked about before. Axial tilt, something really big hit it sometime in the past and effectively flipped it on its side, or flipped it on its head. Or you can look at it, it's slightly tilted 3 degrees, it just spins in the wrong direction. The year, 225 Earth days, but the day is 116 Earth days, so it spins very slowly. And earlier I said we need to be able to spin up a planet. Well, this is a good candidate for it. Mars, has a day cycle very close to Earth, so you wouldn't have to worry about spinning it up. Okay, next. Okay, so for Venus, shorten the day, build ocean basins. It turns out that because Mars hasn't really had plate tectonics in a long time, that it's relatively flat except for some big volcanoes. So if you imported an ocean and terraformed it, you would end up with effectively a planet-wide shallow ocean and a few big islands. So we would want to shape the surface a little bit. Build ocean basins, build mountains, continents. Got to reduce the atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure on Venus at the surface is about 95 atmospheres, 95 times that of Earth. And what's interesting, Venus actually has a lot of nitrogen. It's got about 3 atmospheres of pressure of nitrogen. So in addition to getting rid of a lot of CO2, you're going to have to get rid of a lot of nitrogen to make it livable. It's pretty hot, so that's an issue. Again, get rid of CO2, get rid of nitrogen, import water and oxygen. Okay, next. Okay, spinning up a planet, that's an exercise in angular momentum. I won't go through the equations here, but it turns out if you have an impactor, typical asteroid, 170 kilometers in diameter, if you hit it at the right point, you can shorten or lengthen the day by 1.4 Earth days. So if you have 82 such impactors, you can, spin up the planet so that its day cycle is pretty close to what Earth is. And also, with these big impactors, you can shape the surface, you can deliver water, you can deliver silicates, hydrogen, also big explosions, so you might be able to blast off a fair amount of atmosphere just in the course of shaping the surface. Next. Okay, Paul Birch. This is a published paper, peer-reviewed paper from, I guess, the late 90s in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. He came up with an approach to terraform Venus. And he said, build a big sunshade at the Venus-Sun L1 point. Is everyone familiar with the L1 point or what the L1 point is? Okay, I'll go over that here in a little bit. But anyway, it's building a big shade in a position that's fairly stable between the Sun and Venus. So you block out all the sun that would otherwise hit Venus. And because you've blocked out all the sun, he says it cools 5 degrees per year. I suspect that's a little optimistic. But anyway, if it's 5 degrees per year, then in 100 years you're close to 0, and another 100 years, CO2 begins to settle out in the liquid form. And at that point, you export or bury the CO2, import water, release oxygen, and open up the sun's shade, and you're home free. I say import Earth life. Again, we've talked about some of the complexities. That may actually be the more challenging part of terraforming, but it's probably solvable. Okay, the L1 point. Assume the big white dot is the Sun, and assume the planet is Venus. Then there's a point between those two that's effectively stable with a little bit of effort. And you've heard of the L4 and L5 points. Those are also there. Those are very stable. Once you're at the L4 or L5 point, it's going to take an effort to move away. The L1 point is not quite as stable. It takes a little bit of effort to stay there, but it doesn't take much. It's kind of like being on a hill. Once you start rolling off, it takes more and more energy to get back to the top. But the L1 point is a convenient place to park things so that you block the sun that would otherwise hit the planet. And could be very useful in terraforming. Because Venus doesn't have a magnetic field, that's probably where you would want to put some giant magnets to protect it from the solar wind and other particles that come from the sun. Next. One of the crazy ideas that David and Robert and I have worked on is putting a solar shade at the Sun-Earth L1 point. You know, a small one to reduce the sunlight just enough to, counter global warming. And this is what one image might look like. And because you have effectively solar sails at the L1 point, if you converted those to solar cells to convert the light into energy, and beam it to Earth, you could actually get a lot of energy. And that's, again, that's one of the schemes. We can talk about it later if you like. Okay, next. At least in that case, it's a fairly small. That's what the shade would look like relative to Earth. Now, in the case of Venus, the sunshade would be actually bigger than the planet, so it's a fairly massive structure. Next. Okay, next. Marty Fogg, came up with another terraforming approach to Venus, and you start out with, a present atmosphere of CO2 and nitrogen. And next. And then you seed it with, modified cyanobacteria and water and hydrogen. And this initiates a reaction that eventually, converts all the CO2 to carbon laying on the surface of the planet, and water and nitrogen and oxygen. Now again, you have more nitrogen than you need, so part of this effort's going to have to involve taking the excess nitrogen away. Next. At that point, again, you resort to the sunshade at the Sun-Venus L1 point, and that results in cooling. The atmosphere cools off, the water rains and fills up your ocean basins. And next. And final atmosphere, nitrogen, oxygen, a little bit of CO2. You have oceans. You've also got a lot of carbon laying on the surface that you would have to deal with. But someone else came up with an idea for that. Next. In his paper, he said it needs 4 times 10 to the 19th kilograms of hydrogen to, make that reaction work. That results in a 100-meter thick layer of carbon laying on the surface of the planet. Now, if you are really good at genetic engineering, maybe that carbon could be in the form of little diamonds, which might make the place interesting. Another guy came up with a modification for that. He said, let's import some calcium and magnesium from Mercury, and we can make carbonates out of those. And the carbonates then reduce the amount of hydrogen you need, and the carbonates also are a lot more stable and perhaps even useful. And he said, hey, this will take 10,000 to 1,000,000 years to do. So if you're going to think in terms of terraforming, it's got to be a long-term project. Now, you can always wave your arms and say, well, we'll have advanced technology then, we can probably shorten the time. And there's probably some truth to that, but based on what we know now, it will take some time. Next. Just an excursion, 4 times 10 to the 19th kilograms of hydrogen. That's a lot of hydrogen. One way to think of it, if you had a cargo sphere 4 kilometers in diameter that you filled up with liquid hydrogen and built a tanker around that so you can move materials around the solar system, you would only need 16, 17 million such tankers. So again, to quantify the level of effort that this would require gives you some idea. Okay, next. So terraforming requires energy, time, technology, commitment, perhaps artificial intelligences, and that's a question. Trust and a spacefaring civilization with a long view. I don't know that humanity's ever committed to a project that requires, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years to complete. And, what kind of civilization would be able to make that kind of commitment? That's a question. Okay, next. The Russians always seem to get it first. In 1971, they published a paper and pointed out the fact that on Venus, the current Venus we have today, if you go up, I think it's 50, 60 kilometers, you reach a point in the atmosphere where the temperature and pressure of the CO2 is very Earth-like. So if you build a big metal sphere and fill it with oxygen, nitrogen, which is lighter than CO2, you've effectively got a Zeppelin which will float at that altitude. So the Russian proposal is to build floating cities, based on the Zeppelin principle. And recently, Gregory Landis has, been pushing that idea. I think he came up with it independently, and something very similar. So it is possible to have cities and colonies on Mars without colonizing or without terraforming. And there on the right's another image of a cloud city that some of you may recognize. So, okay, next. And here's what an artist visualized that Venus might actually look like if we terraformed it. And next. The future can be, a pretty grand thing. We could have descendants living in very advanced cities on foreign worlds if we're willing to, make the commitment to make it happen. And finally, we won't find any planets with a big sign on them, but I think we have to be selective about the planets we do choose. Again, to avoid ethical and safety issues. But if a world is, a sterile world, is there really an ethical problem with terraforming it? And I guess that's all I've got.
Yeah, thanks. That's really a nice overview. It seems like what we should be doing is having some small biospheres and just check our areas. Let's say and they won't work. We know they won't work, but we learn from our experiences. Is anyone doing this? A little bit of genetic engineering?
Well, you had the biodome experiment, but they wanted to see if they could create a stable ecology. That they didn't start out with sterile dirt. So, yeah, to answer your question, no, I don't think anyone is doing the basic research that we need to do. But there are things that we can do today. Like take sterile soil, a simulant for maybe the lunar regolith, and see what's necessary to turn that into living soil that can grow grass and tomatoes. That's, if anyone's interested in a science project that they can do today, there it is. Okay, I can't see real well here. Any other questions?
How would you solve the magnetic problem?
What I'm thinking of doing, we talked about the L1 point, is setting up a giant magnet at that point. And you can use light from the sun to power it. And this giant magnet then would deflect the particles from the sun and protect the atmosphere, and also eliminate the radiation problem with lack of a radiation belt. So that would be my solution. But you could also wrap the planet with a giant magnetic coil and do it that way. So there's different approaches, but it will require a technological fix.
Do you have any idea when we could get some Mars dirt to start experimenting with?
You'll have to ask someone from NASA on that. I know there are lots of people that want to bring some back, and I think that'd be great. But we have a pretty good idea of what the Martian soil is. One thing I think that has surprised people is there's perchlorates in the Martian soil. Perchlorates is very toxic to humans. It's a very fine dust. So the explorers, the first settlers tramping around Mars are going to have some issues to deal with. Okay. Yes, sir.
Venus is called Earth's twin. Earth has a nickel-iron core that's hot,
Yep.
okay? But what happens to the core of Venus if you spin it up? Will it not generate a magnetic field at that point?
Maybe. You know, but that's one of those experiments you're probably going to have to run to find out. And also by, you know, hitting the planet with a big rock, would you reinitiate the tectonic plates? You know, that's another question. Possible. But again, we're talking about experiments that are just so big that they've never been run. So, entirely possible.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about what are you thinking about to control a 170-some kilometer rock? I mean, the 10-kilometer rock is an extinction level event for us right now, the size of Everest. So how do you visualize us lassoing and controlling something even much bigger?
Remember that slide where I said trust? We had to have trust. But yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. People who are terraforming a world, you know, have material and energy resources that they could use to, you know, exterminate life on Earth if they so chose. And yeah, moving asteroids around, again, we know how to move mass around. It's just, you know, we have to scale up the motors and the rockets to do that.
If you're impacting Venus to a point where you're getting through its atmosphere and actually hitting the ground, enough to actually start spinning the planet up with big rocks, those are mass accelerators, mass drivers. And you'll be knocking debris off of Venus that will start sky-hooting all over the place around the solar system. What do you do to keep that from re-impacting Earth and other bodies?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. Now keep in mind, you know, you got a really thick atmosphere that's going to, you know, slow down anything, you know, projected from the surface. But yeah, there could be debris, and one of the advantages of using the big rock approach is you can blast a lot of the atmosphere into to space, you know, and reduce part of your problem about getting rid of nitrogen and CO2.
The atmosphere won't hurt us, but the rocks that come off of Venus could very well cause problems.
Okay, so that's a little detail that might have to be worked out, yeah. John there in the back?
Yes, you talked about spinning up a world.
Yeah?
How would you go about doing
You hit it with a big rock.
Glancing blow.
Yeah, one of the parameters is, well, we don't have a good.
It would be like taking a basketball, putting it on, spinning it up by hitting it with rapid fire BBs.
Yeah, so you want to hit the edge, you know, as tangential as you can get to it. The closer you come to the center, the less effective you are.
That's right.
But again, it's an exercise in angular momentum. If anyone's interested in a physics project, that might be one to think about. David?
I think we've got a lot of benefits of doing that. If we can divert some of the Earth's orbit crossing asteroids, which are really threatening us in the long term, we can get rid of those and start to spin up Venus with some good effects. But it's still a problem. But we've got a lot of solar energy working over a lot of time.
And you also don't have an infinite supply of asteroids. If you use them all up, you know, that's not necessarily a good thing too. And then you run into legal questions. Who owns this asteroid? And can I use it to spin up my planet? Or are you the guy who wants to mine it for gold and platinum? So, you know, but if you go out to the Oort cloud, you might be able to use comets. And again, that would be, you know, there are lots of comets in the Oort cloud. We're thinking, you know, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of, you know, pretty big ice balls out there. So maybe use ice balls as opposed to asteroids. Yes, sir.
What kind of time frame are you thinking that this would take to terraform a planet?
At this point, you know, without a lot more knowledge, it's going to be, just a guesstimate. And we're looking at the minimum centuries and probably more likely millennia, from start to finish.
I was going to say about 1,000 years given your parameters.
Yeah, and again, the question of importing Earth life, I just kind of tried to, bring up some of the complexities of that. But that is going to be a challenging project into itself. Just how do you bring all these little critters and infect the dirt and create all these ecology cycles that make everything go and start from nothing. That's not a trivial problem, and that may take as long as getting rid of the atmospheres. Again, that may take a millennia or two. The sequoias, the redwoods, those are wonderful trees, but some of those are 500 years old. So if you wanted to grow a redwood forest, that's 500 years, 1,000 years right there. So, again, not a trivial problem, but at the end of the day, you've got a habitable world for humanity, and, that can last millions of years. Okay. Sir?
I don't understand why we have to make impact. Couldn't we have a large enough body and simply get it close enough to Venus and let the gravity affect it? Two objects.
Yeah, I use
Very simple.
I use the big rock description, because I think that's pretty clear on how you could, spin up a body that way. It's certainly possible to do it in less violent ways. You could set up a mass driver on the surface and just, throw out, masses, small masses continuously until you got up to the, spin rate that you wanted. And you can also, as you said, put another big mass to circle the world to begin to spin it up, or use jets, or maybe advanced technologies that we can't envision. But yeah, there are alternatives to the big rock approach.
We could use Venus's atmosphere and get rid of some of it as its own mass driver.
That's right. That's right.
Would you also need an artificial moon to be in place to keep the oceans, tides going?
Yes, you would.
If you wanted tides, with Venus, you don't really have a moon, so the oceans, the only tides would be solar tides, and that would be pretty minor. Now, if you wanted to terraform Mercury, the solar tides would be horrendous.
Well, the solar tides would be stronger on Venus. The problem is, if you're going to use Earth light, Earth is adapted to having a moon. We are adapted to the lunar cycle of our moon, and all life on this planet is affected by it. So if you're going to grow a colony of Earth stuff on Venus, it'll either have to adapt rapidly to no moon, or we got to give it one.
And does it have to be a full moon, or can it be just, a fake moon, that, a big mylar balloon that orbits? Is it the light, or is it the gravity from the moon that affects Earth life? We don't really know. So again, the gravity question is an unknown, and the effect of the moon is an unknown. It may be that humans can adapt very easily to low gravity environments, and maybe we adapt very easily to planets that don't have moons. Don't know.
In the case of the dung beetle, it's the light. It's some fantastic experiments were done in an observatory with the duplicating the sky and the lunar light, and the bugs were responding to the light, not to the gravity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it may be light, in which case we could put up a fake balloon to simulate the moon, and maybe that's just more comforting to people too. So, okay, good thought. Sir?
I mean, like you said earlier about terraforming actual space colonies, wouldn't it be possible to make the moon out of some reflective material and still have two different civilizations, but the moon would work for the terraforming?
Are we talking about Earth moon? Earth's?
I mean, like simulating an Earth moon on like Venus. Couldn't you still make like a colony, like you were saying?
Oh yeah. You're talking about a space settlement that would also played the part of being an artificial moon. Yeah, I don't see any reason you couldn't do that. So, yeah, our ancestors are going to have a lot of, our descendants are going to have a lot of options. Okay. David?
I sometimes get interested in growing plants, and some of them, like lettuce, they're just great. They're really easy. Some of them, like polonium, when I started growing polonium, they're so susceptible to dabbing off with the fungi in the soil. It won't grow in regular soil. It has to be freshly uncovered soil. So you see them around highway cuts. So I said, well, I'll generate some. I'll get the living parts out of it, and I heated it. And it just wasn't regular soil. Water would not fit. So when you start playing around with these things, you start learning about them.
Oh, that's right, that's right. And the sequoias require a very specific climate to grow. Yeah, if you get too far inland or too far close to the ocean, yeah, they don't grow.
So do we have these experiments being done? Or should we be in Orion, TVIW, should we be trying to stimulate them by giving prizes at science fairs for people who do science fair projects involved with stimulating life?
I think that's a good idea. We'll have to discuss that further. Okay, here in the back.
Last thing, when you're talking about terraforming other worlds, again, we're talking about moving Earth life there. And we have not just a very complex biological system, we have a very complex mineral system. We have to have certain trace elements in our diet every day that if we go to a deserted island and we don't find them, we can die just as dead from a lack of magnesium or a lack of other trace elements that may be missing in our diet. If the soil of Venus doesn't have those same amounts of trace elements, what are we going to do?
Well, we're going to have to import them. And yeah, the objective is to make the soil of Venus or Mars or any world that we're terraforming as, well, it's going to have to be Earth-like enough to support Earth life.
As close to normal as we can
Yeah.
get.
Now, if we need magnesium, we can go to, an asteroid, get it, and, rain it down on the planet. So as long as we recognize that we need it, we can probably go get it. The problem would be, probably the first time around, we'll find out the hard way that, oh, yeah, we need that stuff.
Yeah.
But until you run the experiment, you won't really know. Okay. Let me ask one question of the audience here. If we're going to terraform a world and we're deciding, do we import mosquitoes or not? Who would vote for importing the mosquitoes? Okay, 1, 2.
You asked the guy.
Who would vote for leaving them out?
They're currently absolutely essential to our economy, our biology. Bats eat them, for one thing, by the billions, trillions.
Yeah, but life is pretty adaptable. Don't you think they'd find something else to eat?
Perhaps.
Well, yeah, and
How do you keep the cockroaches out?
well, you don't bring them.
Sorry.
I'm not sure they do anything good for me. I'd be happy to leave them. But again, you're talking about a fairly complex problem, and I'm not sure that I have the answer. But hopefully by the time we're able to, move this kind of quantity of material around the solar system, we will have some of these answers. But, right now I don't see any showstoppers other than just the scale of the project. Thank you very much.